Right, so let's get started. So welcome everybody to this session of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Town Centres. Today what we're going to be discussing is that relationship between the property owner and occupier. And it's a relationship which I think it's fair to say has been pushed beyond breaking point over recent years for very good reasons. And what that has meant is what we're looking at potentially significant changes in this relationship. And remember, this is a relationship which governs much of what happens on the high street. So it is important to all of us. It's also really important to the broader economy. I think many people forget just the impact of the role of the property industry, especially in things like pensions, etc. So we have to be really concerned and take a keen interest in terms of the role of this relationship and how it has evolved in the recent past. So just reflecting in recent years on some of the evolution we've seen in my lifetime, there was a time when upward only rental reviews where retail took up prime space in towns and city centres and pushed out other uses as a result. That was commonplace in my lifetime. And since then, we've seen two really big trends over the decades that have slowly eroded and chipped away at that particular instance of retail being dominant in the core of our towns and city centres. Firstly, the growth of out of town, which we know has had an impact on the high street. And then secondly, the digital economy, not least through the growth of online shopping, but also other online services, which has completely changed the game. Over time, this has put a strain on this relationship. There have been concerns in recent years around the cost of rents, whether landlords can be more flexible with occupiers because of some of the challenges of occupiers, and occupiers realizing that they've got more than one route to market, especially if they are a retailer and are now able to trade online. But on top of those two trends, there's also been two major economic shocks which have laid bare some of the structural challenges we have in terms of the owner-occupier relationship. The first one starting in the US back in around 2007, 2008, being the financial crash, which was largely in the US around the property market and it being over-leveraged, something which we were not insulated from, which had a massive impact on us over here, something which ATCM actually felt at the time. With major turbulence in terms of our commercial property market. The second economic shock, no surprise, the pandemic, which saw major challenges in terms of both owners and occupiers. Occupiers being able to get some level of support for the challenges they experienced during the pandemic, but owners largely not getting much support at all, plus the moratorium on commercial evictions being placed on occupiers, on property owners, leading to significant strain for the sector, with huge debts being accumulated and also some significant losses for some of our biggest commercial property companies as well. Now, what this has led to is talk of a completely new relationship between our property owners and our occupiers, with talks of a move to things like turnover rents as being sort of the new normal, the introduction of an arbitration process to deal with the backlog of rental arrears, and talk of also further government intervention in the relationship going forward as well. So there is a lot which is changing, and I think it's time for the APPG to reflect on some of those changes, if they're heading in the right direction, if there is any way in which it's felt important for the APPG to support the government in making sure those interventions work well for the high street, to create that collaborative relationship between both the owner and the occupier. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by getting a property perspective on some of these changes, some of the issues we've seen, and then we're going to get an occupier perspective on the situation. So can I start by bringing in Jon Fletcher from the British Property Federation to give us an overview of some of the challenges we've seen for the property industry?
Thanks, OJ, and good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, can hear you fine.
Right, fantastic. I'll crack on. So yeah, good morning, everyone. Jon Fletcher from the British Property Federation. Our members are owners, managers, developers of mostly commercial property, and they're mostly institutional capital. So our members are the likes of Aviva Investors, L&G, M&G, British Land Securities. So, you know, ultimately these are big businesses that are effectively collectively owned by all of us that have savings and investments. And I guess that is an important point to make, particularly in a high street context. So it's possibly not as widely known as it should be that if you look at who owns the high street, 70% of retail space in the UK is ultimately sort of publicly owned, be that through local authorities, through charities, through pension funds, through insurance companies. And roughly 60% of the top 22 high streets in the UK are owned in that way as well. So when we talk about who owns the high street, it's all of us. Just to add a little bit to OJ's context setting. So even before the pandemic hit, in the decade up to 2018, retail rents outside of London had fallen by 30% in nominal terms. Once you add in inflation, that's more than roughly 50% fall. And as I say, that was before the pandemic hit. If you look at shopping centre valuations, for example, they reached the high in roughly 2017, I think. And as of late last year, those values had fallen around 70% since 2017, and rents had roughly halved. So it's an enormous shift that's happened in a very short space of time, and as OJ says, that clearly placed strains on the relationships between property owners and their occupiers. However, that you know, there are some bright spots, and I'll get onto those in a bit. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that property owners faced during COVID, the moratoriums and the impact that they had on the industry, and sort of where we go from here. I guess, you know, in terms of COVID challenges, there were a few, there were many. I'll pick out some of the main ones. So firstly, one of the first things that happened after the pandemic really emerged was that the letting and investment market went dead, as people sort of got to grips with what the new situation meant for everyone. Logistics and then the residential market pulled through. Indeed, logistics went into something of an overdrive, as there was increased demand for space for you know, mainly to support online shopping. Retail and town centre property, not so, sadly. COVID accelerated what was already a fair bit of capital flight from these sectors, and there was very little or no new equity or debt capital available. Clearly, property owners also had to adapt to new ways of working, as have we all, in terms of working remotely and supporting people through tough times. It obviously changes to how to do businesses. So, you know, starting to set up virtual property viewings, but also there was a lot of development and construction activity taking place before the pandemic. And clearly that got hit by supply chain issues and you know, the question of how do you construct during a pandemic. And then there was also a big issue around planning applications and making sure that these didn't stall, that there continued to be a pipeline of planning applications, and that construction could start on those projects where planning permission would otherwise expire. So I think it's fair to say that the property industry worked well among itself, with its stakeholders, with government, to find practical and policy solutions to most of those problems. Then, of course, there is rent collection, and I guess that's where I'll focus some time on. Collection rates for most types of property are usually above 90% in whatever we call normal times. After the pandemic started, these rates fell to roughly between 50 and 60%, worse in some sectors. And that's after 90 days from the due date. So the amount that was paid as it was due was much lower than that. I guess the collection rate was similar for service charges, and in a way, this was a bigger issue at the time than rent collection, because service charges go exclusively towards supporting the buildings that they relate to. So they're not effective. They're not really the property owner's money. They are the money of the property, and they are used exclusively for the upkeep and benefit of that property. And while you may think that the amount of service charge needed to support a property during a pandemic when nobody's going to that property is a lot lower, actually most shopping centres and many other properties had some sort of essential retail use, and therefore they had to be kept open, and therefore there had to be an element of expenditure anyway. I guess the main thing to say in the context of rent collection and what happened during the pandemic was that property owners obviously hugely understanding and sympathetic of occupiers' positions. There are many cases of support being given. So, for example, Landsec set up a £100 million plus fund to support its occupiers. British Land gave rent freeze to many of its independent businesses. Workspace Group, an office supplier, also gave 50% rent reduction. So, these are just some of many. And this all comes because ultimately property owners and occupiers are partners. They need each other, and property owners, of course, want to see their occupiers do well and survive and continue to let their property, particularly in the context of a market that's really tough and it's really hard to find new occupiers. You want to keep hold of the ones you've got. So our members look to engage their occupiers wherever possible, generally successfully. However, there was resistance in some cases. I think what our members found was that generally engaging with smaller independents, SMEs, etc., was a lot easier and more productive. There were a few more challenges in the context of larger national businesses. And these were, to a certain extent, exacerbated by the moratoriums, which put in place very stringent restrictions on property owners' recourse and ability to collect rent debt. And this was sadly, in our view, abused by some businesses, including those that some which were able to stay open for the whole of the pandemic, and yet used this as cover to not pay their rent and not really engage with their property owners. I think, in terms of the moratoriums, I think it's fair to say that many in the property industry understood why the government had taken such action. Many disagreed with the need for it. As I've already said, nobody wants their property owned, nobody wants their occupiers to fail, nobody wants empty shops. But there was an understanding. However, this was on the basis that they were temporary emergency measures and would be lifted in fairly short order. However, so there's therefore enormous disappointment when these measures kept getting rolled over again and again and again, with no real meaningful intervention by government or no real meaningful support by government to property owners and occupiers to get together and sort of come to mutually beneficial solutions. So, yes, there was the Code of Practice that was published in June of 2020. However, I think most people felt that this didn't really go far enough and that the government could do more. Indeed, both we and occupier bodies collectively approached government twice in 2020 with suggestions as to how government could support negotiation more actively than they were doing at the time. And sad to say, there was very little interest or uptake from government. They saw it as a kind of a market issue. The market needed to sort itself out. However, at the same time, the measures that they'd put in place were effectively freezing the market and holding up resolution. So it really was a sort of catch-22 situation. Things started to look better as businesses started to reopen in the course of last year, 2021. I think it was obviously good for everyone for the cash to start flowing through the high street again. And where are we now? Well, we've got at the end of the moratoriums, we've got a new arbitration system. We've also, to a large extent, got a market that's resolved itself. And so I think in most people's minds, the new arbitration scheme won't really be particularly heavily used. I guess, I only wish that the government had introduced something like that sooner, and not sort of prolonged the uncertainty for as long as it did, because I think it has prompted, or rather the introduction of the arbitration scheme has prompted people to come together that previously hadn't. So if it had been introduced sooner, then perhaps the market would have resolved itself sooner as well. But where are we now? I think one of the positives of the pandemic, from a property owner-occupier relationship point of view, has been that there has been really unprecedented communication between the two sides. A lot of our members report having better and deeper relationships with their retail and hospitality occupiers now than they ever have, really, because they've been forced to understand their occupiers' businesses a lot better. And I think that's really the starting point that we should build on for what might be a new model relationship between owners and occupiers. I guess a couple of things to note before I hand back to OJ. Firstly, to say that the legislative framework that we've got governing the relationship between owners and occupiers, the Landlord-Tenant Act 1954, is out of date. It's in sore need of revision. It's currently getting in the way of some of the more innovative and flexible letting arrangements that people want to put in place. It's lacking clarity in a number of key areas, and it doesn't really do much to support the decarbonisation of retail and high street space that's going to happen or have to happen over the next 20 years or so. And it also doesn't really do enough to support the sharing of data between owners and occupiers, and this is particularly important in the context of turnover rents. So I'll leave it there. I think we've got we've turned a corner, and we've got some good things to look forwards to, but there's obviously a lot of hard work to be done between now and then. Thanks, OJ.
Oh, that's great, Jan. So I think just to clarify, in terms of that arbitration process, and it is, it does look positive in many ways. Is it a case of it's the right thing to do, it's just a bit late in terms of the process and should have been introduced earlier?
I mean, our view has always been that that the market would have sorted itself out, and that the rational self-interest of both parties would have led to the right sort of outcomes in most cases. Yes, it would have helped if the government had provided clarity a bit sooner about what it was going to do. I don't think it was helpful that the government was rolling the moratoriums forward sort of on a quarterly basis, and therefore nobody really knew how long this was going to last, and therefore nobody could really plan around it. I think if the government had provided a bit more clarity up front, then everybody would have been in a much better position to do deals with each other.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much for that contribution. Like I say to everybody, questions and comments, please do put them in the chat box. Vivian, can I bring you in to build on what Jan has given us?
Yeah, sure.
I know you've got additional thoughts, and also there's something else around government intervention, which is specific to England. I'm going to apologise because I know we got Douglas Chapman MP's office on the call, but something specific to England as well, which you want to touch on in relation to the auctioning of property, which has appeared in the Levelling Up white paper. So do you want to take it away?
Sure, thanks AJ. And the problem with coming after Jan is you wonder what else there is to cover, to be honest. But just picking up on a few things, I think in terms of context, one of the issues that the property industry has always had is that it's invisible. Everybody sees the brands that are in the buildings, but nobody really understands what function buildings can perform beyond simply housing an occupier. And what we are starting to see, certainly amongst the bigger players, some of whom Jan mentioned, is where regeneration is happening. There is a massive curation of place occurring, with the needs of the local community very much being integrated into the design of place, which will then have a knock-on impact for positive social value for those places, as well as, of course, increasing the enjoyment and amenity of places themselves. And that just doesn't really get any sort of publicity. And it's usually the rather negative stories that come through. And I think another thing that's important in relation to the partnership between property owners and property occupiers is how we collectively manage our environmental responsibility, on the basis that 70% of emissions come from the occupation of space as opposed to the being of space. We're never going to hit our 2050 or 2030 targets for some unless there is collaboration. And whereas often is the case, certainly for the major occupiers and the multiples, there is a sort of C-suite level desire for environmental changes and that would impact what those outcomes could be, when it actually filters down to the sort of management level within the spaces themselves, that message gets diluted. And that's a really important collaboration that we've got to ensure does work. But just picking up on the two things that AJ, you specifically asked me to reference, and the first one being compulsory leasehold auctions, which was announced and is expected to come through in the Queen's speech. This being a way of empowering local authorities to force property owners of vacant space to grant leases to occupiers through an auction system. It's unusual, to say the least. I think we all recognise the need to revitalise shopping places, but dictating what somebody should do with a space is really, it is government intervention in private property. And I suppose speaking with my lawyer's hat on, the UK has a very stable legal system of property ownership, and something like this actually threatens that level of transparency and stability, which has a broader impact beyond the owner who's affected by it. It actually has market impact. I mean, there's the technical challenges of managing this, because ownership of property isn't always obvious. It's not always a local owner. It's not always an owner within our shores. So there will be challenges in understanding who it is that's supposed to be granted the lease. I would say that indiscriminate lettings aren't good for place. I mentioned the role of property owners in curating space, where there's fragmented ownership. Of course, that happens a lot less, but that's not good for value, both in terms of the owner, but also in terms of neighbouring occupiers, if there are indiscriminate lettings going on. So I think the bottom line here is that we've got too much retail space, and we need to be thinking creatively about how that's used, not just trying to find anybody to put into the space. And the fact is that business rates are too high. So even if you do put somebody in, they're going to be facing business rates. I question how long they're going to be there. Business rates are a big part of the reason why we've got vacant shops in the first place. So unless you actually treat the cause of the problem, it's not going to have a long-term impact. So there's a range of reasons why, although at first glance it looks like a good idea, I think there's many reasons why it's not operable. And then the other thing, OG, you wanted me to pick up on was online sales tax, just very briefly, because time's moving on. There is, of course, as we all know, a consultation out at the moment. It's operating in an environment where retailers have more and more moved on to an omni-channel platform. So we need to be considering this in that context. Although I did read a stat recently that the vast number of retailers, even with an online presence, are supportive of an online sales tax. At Revo and also with the Shopkeepers campaign, we're supportive in principle, but only if it's used to reduce business rates for those who are likely to be paying an online sales tax. Otherwise, we just end up with an increased taxation. And so I think that if it is going to happen, it does need to be very firmly fixed to a reduction in the UBR, so the tax percentage that by reference to which business rates are paid. So the two need to be very closely linked. And I think the second thing is we've got a lot of headlines that are currently in this consultation. And if it is to be introduced, then the next consultation needs to be about the detail, because that's where the devil will be. That's me done, OJ.
Yeah, Vivian, that's brilliant. What I'll do is I'll put a link actually to that consultation in the chat box in a second. And I've got no doubt there's a lot right across the industry that will certainly agree with you on the issue of the online sales tax, and also making sure it's an opportunity to do what it should do, which is reduce the business rates burden on property-based businesses. So it's balanced and then reflects what a more modern economy looks like in terms of the emergence of a digital alternative. So questions and comments and all of this, please, in the chat box, and I'll bring you in once we have our third speaker on the agenda. So we've heard the property perspective quite comprehensively, which I think has been excellent. I'd now like to introduce David Sheen on behalf of UK hospitality sector being one of the ones which has been incredibly damaged by the pandemic. So in terms of the stress of the pandemic on the occupier, I think it is a sector which it's important to hear from. So David, can I give you the floor, so to speak?
Yeah, thank you, AJ. And I think I could end up saying a slightly different version of history to Jon. We've shared a lot of time together, and Vivian, over the last 2 years, working with government on solutions. And as Jon said, we've worked collaboratively to put some solutions to government. We haven't always agreed on every word of every document, but I think we've worked pretty collaboratively, and hopefully that is, as Jon said, that sort of model for future collaboration, because a cliche, but we've got more in common than we have apart. That's my nice start. So sorry, just briefly, UK Hospitality Trade Association for the hospitality sector, pubs, bars, restaurants, hotels, nightclubs, coffee shops, visitor attractions, a whole wide range of business types. We do have landlords within our membership, but I'm going to speak sort of exclusively from a tenant perspective here. Yeah, obviously the pandemic, and Jon sort of talked about the progression of measures throughout. It has been a very difficult time. The moratorium, clearly from our perspective, was vital. I very much agree with Jon that the practice of sort of rolling it over with a week to go before the deadline on a quarterly basis was highly disruptive, and it didn't allow for any sort of it didn't allow for that negotiation to be happening. So I think it was, the way it was done was probably not conducive to a negotiated settlements. But as it was, I do think it was absolutely vital that there was a moratorium in place. It possibly didn't need to go on for as long as it did, or is still going on technically. In terms of experience of landlords, again, I think quite a mixed picture. And I think if Jon, if it was put back to Jon, I think he'd say the same as well about the tenant. But I think Jon very clearly did say that there were issues with tenants. From a hospitality or occupier perspective, we had some really positive stories of collaboration. Certainly, again, from the pub company landlords were offering great support, but also very much in the commercial landlord world, there was a lot of support available, and quite a strong understanding of the challenges that businesses, that operators, occupiers were facing. I think probably quite a lot of that was skewed towards SMEs, which is, I suppose, fair enough. But some of the bigger hospitality businesses were really struggling. But touch wood, the vast majority survived and got through. But I am very, having spoken to you a lot, I'm very, very cognizant that there were landlords who perhaps didn't play by the spirit of the rules. Sorry, tenants who didn't play by the spirit of the rules. we reckon across hospitality there was about 2.5 billion in rent debts, sort of at the peak period of the pandemic. Although as we'll see that that has come down significantly. Sort of looking post-pandemic, rent arrears definitely have started to come down. I think to Jon's point again, the vast majority of businesses have now started to come to agreement. There are still those that are really struggling, and I think that's particularly at that sort of smaller end where it's either a sort of, well, where it could be a single site occupier and a single site landlord, and literally neither of them can afford to give or take. So I think that's where the real difficulties lie. But our feeling is most of the rent debt has now been resolved in one way or another, which is obviously a positive. In terms of flexibility from landlords in payment terms, again, quite a positive story. We have heard anecdotally a few terrible stories of 3 months to pay the entire rent arrears, and rent arrears being written off on the basis of having a break clause of 3 months or something, which basically made the tenant completely vulnerable. But I think they are definitely the minority. The majority of our membership now are actually on a pretty even footing with their landlords and are working towards paying off the accrued rent debt. And I think actually the arbitration process is really interesting. I think the greatest strength of the arbitration process is that it is unappealing to businesses. Businesses have looked at it and gone, actually, I'd much rather get around the table and come to a solution. Going through the arbitration process can be, well, it's likely to be costly. It's likely to involve providing a huge amount of data, much of that data you don't want to be providing. So I think because of that, more and more businesses have decided that actually we'd rather just come to a negotiated settlement and avoid the arbitration process. But having said that, there are those examples where I think there are businesses that will need to go through it, and it's probably the businesses that are least able to go through it or are least well set up for it are the ones that are going to have to use it. That sort of smaller occupier who is broke, frankly, that has to stump up some money to go through the process, have to then prove their viability. And I think that's going to be a very difficult process. I'd be interested to hear Jon's view, but we still think that the number of businesses that will go through that process are going to be fairly small, to be honest. In terms of that future relationship, I'm pretty optimistic. I think the point made around a better understanding of each other's business models, I think that really has come out of the last 2 years. People have understood what the challenges are on either side of the fence. I think that collaborative approach hopefully will continue, and that with that as well, sort of a bit more of a sense of flexibility. Hopefully we don't need flexibility because we'll be fine. But I think understanding the challenges that businesses are facing is great. And actually, I spoke to Crown Estate yesterday, who were putting on a jobs fair for all of their tenants. They'd spoken to all of their tenants, their occupiers, understood that obviously the workforce agenda was a real problem, and are putting on this jobs fair. And I think that's just a perfect example of how collaborative it can be. And if we work together, hopefully the same on things like energy prices, that you could see work together there, and I'm sure that's already going on. So I'm positive around that sort of relationship going forward. We've touched on business rates. I think again, mutual interest there between occupier and owner. Something needs to be done there from a high street perspective. The status quo is disastrous. So we need to work together to get through that. And I think online sales tax does offer an opportunity there. As Vivian says, as long as it's used to offset the business rates burden on the sector. I suppose the final thing around the upcoming review of landlord-tenant legislation, I agree with you on it's not fit for purpose as it stands. I think, again, there's probably quite a lot of common ground we can take as both an owner and an occupier perspective. There will, of course, be differences of opinion, but that's to be expected. But I think as much as we can find that common ground, we're in a better position to go to government to provide the solutions. And sorry, final point. Fora like this are great for actually bringing this together and actually working together, finding solutions. That's me.
Brilliant. That's great, David. And I think there's a lot in that which I just want to pick up. Can I start by bringing in Andy from BBPA? So on the issue which we've had mentioned by both Vivian and David, issue of business rates, which you've actually mentioned in the chat box. So do you want to give your view on the role an online sales tax should play, preferably in terms of balancing out the cost and burden of business rates on the high street?
Thanks, OJ. Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously from a pub industry perspective, the rates burden is, it's killing pubs, and it's something that we definitely see the role of the OST to help mitigate some of that business rates burden for hospitality and retail. And I think one of the challenges at the moment, of course, and I think this was referenced already, is that the consultation asks a lot of views on this and potential considerations, but doesn't set out very clearly the actual purpose, the actual money they would like to raise, and how exactly that would be offset in terms of the business rates reduction, through the UBR or the mechanism to do that, and also, the concern to make sure that money, it does not impact local authority spending as well. So there's lots of things in there, and it was slightly disappointing that the consultation seemed to just ask lots of questions, but didn't really give people enough to take quite considered positions on some of it. And it just seemed to be, this is quite hard, isn't it? And here's all the challenges, rather than setting out, this is what we intend to do, and here's the options of how we're going to do it, and please provide your feedback. So yeah, lots more to unpick on that, OJ, but I think it has got a really important role going forwards.
Yeah, that's interesting. And also just a quick question on the issue of where your members are in relation to catching up on rental arrears. How are things for your stakeholders?
I think pretty good. I think fortunately, through the pandemic, the relationship between pub landlords and their tenants has been very good. There's been huge amounts of discounted rents and waive rents that have gone into tenants. I think something like £300 million worth across the sector. And we're very much hopeful that the resort of further arbitration or a further need to go down that route would be very, very isolated incidents and few and far between. So yeah, we're confident that we won't have to as David said, the people struggling to work their way through the arbitration system and the costs associated with that.
Brill, that's really useful. So when I started the meeting, I spoke around the first economic shock of the fallout from the retail property market from the financial crash going back to 2007, 2008. And it was around then ATCM had noticed discrepancies in terms of the way business rate calculation has worked. And I think since then, there has been general agreement, I think, across the industry, both with property owners and occupiers, that business rates does need to be reformed. And actually, it is a key part of some of the stress that is placed on the entire high street. But obviously, there are challenges in terms of reform for local government financing. And Graham Galpin, can I bring you in on this point? Because being a former councillor, you will know more than most about some of the challenges around local government finance when it comes to business rates and what reform might mean for those finances. And I see you've put a comment on that issue in the chat box. So do you want to just discuss this a little bit more?
Yes, I'd be delighted to. I absolutely agree that the business rate situation is not fit for purpose. It's forcing more people into penury than it needs to. And I think somebody put underneath Andy's comment about the discounts that are being levied or being provided at the moment being formalised rather in the longer term. But of course, overall, my fear with the online sales tax, and I've had this discussion with lots and lots of people over the years, is that the tax will be levied centrally. It will come from central government, and it will be on turnover. It will be a percentage of your turnover, and it will go into the sales. It will go into central government coffers, and then it has to be redistributed if we are going to be equitable about allowing our local authorities to continue to empty the bins and sweep the streets and do the things that are really important to us. And so therefore that distribution has to be proportional. We know that you guys will in retail will need to see a reflection in a reduction in your business rates. Therefore, the local authority isn't going to get as much money. So how does it come back from government? And, I've been working in various regeneration situations for the best part of 30 years, and I've seen funds come and go, and they are at the whim and the caprice of central government as to how they're distributed. And the temptation is always to look at a way where electability comes into the equation. Not that I would advocate that, and I have to say I have always felt, that in the days when I was doing European funding programs, I always felt that the money went north. And then I met people from the north, and they always said, well, you get all the money down south. So I think that there is some work to do to come up with a way that the redistribution can be neutrally administered so that we get some balance in how it comes back to the market.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree. Having looked at this issue, I think if it was to be done like that and you'd bring the cost of business rates down, you do need to then repatriate some of that money from an online sales tax into local government finances, because local authorities are critical in terms of maintaining place and providing services, so they will need that top up of income. Also, ATCM has many business improvement districts as members as well, and they too would end up losing income if we were to decrease business rates. So we need to make sure that money for local services is still there through a more modern tax framework. So yeah, I mean, I would certainly agree with a lot of that. I think what I also want to chat about just quickly before we disappear. So Vivian's brought up the issue of the auction of property which has been empty for 6 months or more. So starting with you, Graham, do you want to give us your thoughts about the proposals we have so far? And I know it's early days and all we've had is a fairly short paragraph in the Levelling Up white paper and then an article in the Daily Mail leaking a bit more information on what that proposal will look like. We're at the moment expecting it to appear in the Queen's Speech under the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. So do you want to give your thoughts on it, Graham?
Well, this is another one where I'm very, very nervous because, as Vivian said, you're changing the historic structure of ownership, and the authority you have as an owner. Equally, you know, as I think it was Ion said about foreign-based landlords, you know, as we've all had them, people who are anonymous and hidden, they deserve a kick in the pants. But in real terms, as soon as you start forcing auctions, first of all, you need to have the local authority capacity to deal with this new intervention. It's really, really worrying, because at the moment, part of the foundation of the High Street Task Force was to help local authorities who had their resources depleted and their skills depleted. And this is a whole new level. So I am extremely nervous on that score. And if I own a shop in the high street, I'm not talking about large shopping centres, although I could be, I guess, is you tell me I've got to let my shop and you're going to force me to do so, and I'm just sitting on it for reasons of my own, I can just go for permitted development rights and turn it into a house, or into a residence, or into flats. So that could precipitate a whole flood of people coming and altering, you know, with permitted development rights, their retail properties, their you know, evening economy properties, and it's going to leave us with, well, you know, with gaps in the teeth, to be quite frank. You know, I know things have to change, and I know that Resi has to come to town, but we are in danger of precipitating a flood.
Yeah, I hear you. Any other comments on the auction of property as well? And it'd be if anybody from local authority wants to chip in. I know Graham has freedom to speak more candidly, being a former councillor. If there's anybody else from a local authority background that wants to make a comment on this as well, be really interested to hear it. Jan, can I bring you in to get your thoughts on the auction of property?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as with Vivian, I'm pretty skeptical, to be honest. It seems to rest on two fairly big assumptions that I've not seen much evidence for. So firstly is that there are large numbers of units that property owners are holding vacant deliberately. You know, presumably because they don't want to recognise a reduction in their value, or they don't, you know, they're holding out for things to get better. Well, I don't think things will particularly get better in a lot of places. I think rents have structurally reset, and there isn't really going to be much of an improvement. And I think pretty much everyone knows that. So firstly, I don't think that assumption is necessarily correct, although, you know, doubtless there will be the odd occasion where that is true. Secondly, the assumption that there are occupiers willing and waiting in the wings to take this space. And who have the ability to pay the business rates liability, who have the ability to pay the fit out costs, who are willing to commit for a certain period of time, and sort of look after the property. Again, we're not talking, you know, for the most part, we're talking about difficult to let properties in unloved locations, and I'm just not sure that this really is the best use of government resources when it comes to tackling the problems of the high street. I think government would do far better to focus more attention, for example, on business rates, which we've all highlighted as a huge issue, than on this this new initiative that, yeah, I'm not sure will make an awful lot of difference, to be honest.
Yeah, there's a lot of structural challenges there, aren't there, which we really need to get to grips with. The auctioning one, and I know we're still a little bit light on details, so I'm sure there's still more to come in terms of understanding this policy, but it's difficult to see how it would work in the light of some of those structural challenges that remain, that ultimately in some areas it is just pure market failure and forcing the auction of property isn't necessarily the thing which is going to be a solution, especially when the costs of managing that property is going to be too high because of business rates, which, you know, it's going to be impossible to avoid for many. So no, thank you for that. That's really useful. I think, Jon, before you go as well, and Vivian, I'm going to open this one to you. The issue of turnover rents, is that something you are seeing more of now than before? Is it something which is widespread, or still something which is fairly limited in terms of its use?
Yeah, happy to offer some comments, and Vivian can add to them. I think they are still, you know, by far the minority in terms of retail leases. I think that's partly a legacy issue. So while there's been an awful lot of talk about it over the last couple of years, there's still a very large tail of leases that are more traditional. I guess the second thing I'd say is that turnover leases aren't necessarily for everyone. You know, there are a lot of retailers out there whose business model means that they would far rather have a more traditional lease, the certainty of rent payments, you know, known rent payments for the, you know, for the term of the lease, and not have to share any upside with their property owner. So I guess what my members tell me is that a lot of the sort of convenience retailers aren't really interested in turnover leases. They quite like the traditional model, whereas turnover leases appeal far more to sort of fashion retailers and more discretionary spend type retailers. So I think we've got to recognise that. And then secondly, the big challenge with turnover linked leases is assessing how much of the online sales of a business you attribute to particular properties or to the property portfolio in general. And we all know that a physical presence enhances online sales in that area. There's an increase in online sales in that area after a shop opens up. However, every retailer seems to handle allocation of online sales slightly differently, and some of them completely separate their online from their bricks and mortar sales. So figuring out how to do that and how to share the right kind of information so that you can accurately come up with a turnover rent is a huge challenge at the moment.
That's really useful. And Vivian, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that as well.
Yeah, there's certainly interest in principle. So that's there. The challenges, as Jon has explained, are really about the detail of how to implement this. So really, property managers are really sort of scratching their heads over how they're going to make it work. So I think there is interest, but actually making it work is challenging. And also, there's a bit of a cultural issue because traditionally, you know, the turnover levels from retail has been a matter for the retailer alone, and so there hasn't historically been that level of transparency that perhaps we've seen in Europe, where turnover is far more dominant, but equally online isn't as dominant in Europe as it is in the UK. So that problem that Jon was describing there doesn't apply in the same way. Nevertheless, I think there are lessons to be learned by looking to Europe, but I think we're some way to go. But I certainly think that the door is ajar on that, if not open.
Well, that's really useful. And David Sheen, I saw you had your hand up briefly. Did you want to come in to make a comment?
I was just going to come in on the compulsory auction piece and just try and be contrary and say I do think there is potential that it's a good idea. I think the theory is good. I'm not sure. I don't know whether it's one of those that could benefit from a trial rather than full-on national legislation to actually see whether to identify whether it actually does deal with the issues that it's seeking to deal with, or whether it hits the barriers that Jon and Vivian talks about. But in theory, I quite like it. But I appreciate there's a lot of practicalities that others know a lot more about than I do.
No, that's fine. It's great. It's great to get that alternative view. And I think it's important to have that alternative view and to offer an alternative view on something else as well. So say, for example, we heard that the the delaying of the moratorium was challenging for the industry, and it was. I absolutely know it was. But what I will say, in fairness of the government and in defence of some of the civil servants working on policies, I know just how upside down the world was during the pandemic, with everybody not really knowing what was happening from one week to the next in terms of being able to come out from restrictions. So I can imagine how that made decisions on big policy matters really difficult. So, you know, I will say that in favour of the government and civil servants. And finally, before we go, Ian Ferguson, can I bring you in for your comments on the auctioning of property, whether you think it's the right thing, whether you think there's a better way of getting around it?
Thanks, OJ. Well, just very quickly, I think there's a couple of things which the conversation seems to have boiled down to, which is business rates, but also from the compulsory vacant unit perspective, the leasehold auctions. If there is no compulsory landlord register, I'm not quite sure how that's going to be enforced. And I think that's something that actually we would benefit everybody, is to actually know the ownerships of the properties, so that there can actually be a much better engagement with landlords and property owners generally. I know there's a large proportion in public ownership, but there's actually a lot of very key properties in town centres which get blocked by remote landlords. And I think the potential for this compulsory leasehold auction could actually end up forcing people down the using the permitted development rights to actually create even more resi in places where we don't necessarily want it. So I think, yeah, it's boiling down to business rates, I think, and a compulsory landlord register would be two things, and potentially the Landlord-Tenant Act review, maybe three things which perhaps we should be focusing on.
Bro, thank you very much for that, Ian. We're just running out of time, so those comments have been really helpful. What I will do is I will catch up with Stephen hopefully later today to run through all of the comments, discussions, etc. with him, and we can discuss what role the APPG should take on engaging on some of these things. I know in particular the auctioning of property, it is an England only matter. But it might be something the APPG wants to talk to the Department for Levelling Up about, just to make sure we can make sure it works and we mitigate some of the problems discussed, and also discuss the theme for the next meeting as well, which off the top of my head is going to be the 26th of May, where we will discuss issues along a similar theme as well. With regards to recovery post-pandemic. So on that, can I thank the speakers, David Sheen, Vivian, Jon, and everybody that's contributed to the meeting. And I'll be in touch with others around what we've discussed today. So thank you very much, everyone, and I hope to see you soon.